So welcome everyone to our Food for Thought speaker series. We're glad to have you all here with us today for our wonderful and distinguished guest, Dan Grodnick, who's the president and CEO of the Riverside Park Conservancy. And he's going to be discussing saving Stuyvesant Town, how one community defeated the worst real estate deal in history. Just a quick note before we get started, if you can keep yourself on mute, unless you're asking a question in the Q&A section of the session, and if you have questions, you could also put them in the chat. And now I'll hand it off to Bill so he can do our intro for Dan. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to Jeremy and Valerie for keeping hope alive with this program, which we started in the teeth of the pandemic. It's hard to believe, almost a year ago. But we've been here almost every week since then, and if you haven't gone to the Food for Thought website, you really got to go, because everything we've done is there, and it's there and will be there for the great presentations that we've heard and shared. So if you've missed some of them, we hope you will, and we're very grateful to Dan for joining our illustrious group of speakers. I don't want to take much of our time. The format will be similar. Dan will probably talk, give or take, 30, 35 minutes, something like that. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. We will promptly finish at 1, as we always do. And I will just, if I went through his achievements and his resume and his history, we'd be saying goodbye. It'd be 1 o'clock. So I'm going to hit only a few highlights. I actually got to know him before I knew him because he was a very active, famous, and successful city council person. So that was my first awareness of him, and was in many respects the most well-known and accomplished and well-respected politician of his time, which was not so long ago, but he's in a new career now. And I've gotten to know him much better in his current position, which is president and CEO of the Riverside Park Conservancy, which co-runs Riverside Park in our neighborhood here at Columbia, with the New York City Parks Department, and similar to the Central Parks Conservancy and the High Line and some others, have really transformed the park system. For a good part of my life, I used New York City parks, but was usually very careful and was very mindful and aware that I was in a dangerous place. And that's no longer the case, thank God. And in large part, I credit that to the conservancies who have teamed up with the city to not only preserve our parks, but to make them safe and usable. And Dan's been doing an incredible job. And maybe he'll talk a little bit after he talks about the book about what he's doing in Riverside Park to make it better and safer and more interesting, particularly for the northern part of the park, which goes all the way up to the GW Bridge. He is a lawyer by trade, was at a major law firm in New York, and a community activist, which, if you haven't seen this book, it's on Amazon. Get it and read it. It really is terrific. It's called Saving Stuyvesant Town. And for those of you who don't know, it's one of the largest affordable housing complexes in not only New York City or the United States, but in the world. And we are so frustrated these days by trying to build more affordable housing. And Dan played the central role in preserving one of our largest single portfolio of affordable housing. It's really 2 separate large affordable housing complexes right in Lower Manhattan. So I won't spoil the story. I'll let Dan tell the story. But we're very grateful to have him here. Again, it's a great book. You won't be able to put it down. I read it literally over 2 days. So with no further ado, thank you, Dan. Thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate the intro, and thank you for including me on this series, which obviously has been an important one over the course of the year, and hopefully it will go beyond. So thank you for including me. And I thought that I should start with a little bit of background here as I tell the story that is the story of Stuyvesant Town. I was elected to the New York City Council in November of 2005, and I took office in January 2006. And 6.5 months into my first term as a New York City councilman, about 20% of my district went up for sale. So needless to say, that doesn't usually happen in politics. Built by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company as housing for veterans returning from World War II, Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village is, as Bill mentioned, the biggest rental community in the United States. And it is home to about 30,000 mostly middle-class people on the east side of Manhattan. It's a stone's throw from the East Village, the Flatiron Building, and Gramercy Park. And for over 50 years, it stood as a beacon for middle-income New Yorkers and a place to enjoy a stable and affordable life in the heart of Manhattan. Under the care of Mother Met, as Metlife was commonly known to tenants, it was a quiet enclave in the middle of busy Manhattan. It was truly designed to resemble suburban living, where people could safely raise their kids, and they tended to stay for decades. And that's how it was for my own family. I grew up in the neighborhood. I was the only child of a public school teacher and a portfolio manager, and my formative years were in a 2-bedroom apartment in Peter Cooper. And note, and Bill alluded to this in his intro, Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper they're all part of the same whole. I generally refer to them all as Stuytown, but it's really bigger than Stuytown. It's Stuytown and Peter Cooper. My parents moved into the community 40 years earlier, from the moment that I was elected, and they never moved out because it afforded them a reasonable rent, beautiful grounds, and more space than they could otherwise get in Manhattan at their price range. They lived in what is called a rent stabilized unit, which meant that their rent was well below the market rate and could only go up by an amount that was authorized by a public board called the Rent Guidelines Board. And that rent allowed them to continue to live in Manhattan. Then in July of 2006, at the height of the real estate boom, Metlife announced that it would put all 110 buildings in Stuytown and Peter Cooper up for sale, suddenly marketing an opportunity for a new owner to make real changes to the community. And just to put this all into some context. So in the fall of 2005, I had won my election to the city council to represent this district, which went from 14th Street up to 98th Street on the east side. It was my first run at public office. I was a lawyer practicing litigation at Paul Weiss. I served as a federal law clerk in the Southern District of New York, and I saw there was going to be a city council seat that was open in the district where I grew up, and I was very excited about the possibility of representing 160,000 of my neighbors in City Hall. So I ran, and I can tell you the issues in Stuytown tended toward the mundane disputes between the landlord and tenant, like charges on rent bills for improvements, periodic brown water, which seemed to emerge from faucets here and there, and questions of basic maintenance. At no point did anyone even speculate that Metlife might sell this property in the near term, or ever, for that matter. So I won my race. I took office as a brand new city councilman in January 2006. In July, now July of that same year, I got a phone call on my cell phone from the lobbyist for Metlife. And he told me that Metlife was testing the market for a Stuyvesant Town sale, and that they were considering the possibility of marketing the asset, or some words like that I thought were pretty disconnected to the reality of selling the homes of 30,000 human beings. They were marketing the asset, testing the waters. It all sounded pretty hypothetical and speculative the way he described it to me. And by the way, a quick point here for those who may find themselves in a career in government or politics: lobbyists do not ordinarily call the local city councilman when their clients are just in their exploratory phase. They call when they absolutely need to give you a heads up before something pops in the news. And that's exactly what happened here. Before long, it was a public matter that Metlife was planning to sell Stuyvesant Town. Now, as you might imagine, the opportunity to own 80 acres of land in Manhattan does not come along every day. And the real estate world went simply crazy. Bidders from across the globe participated in a white-hot auction that bid the property over $5 billion. And that was billions of dollars more than what had been contemplated by experts only months earlier. The property sold for $5.4 billion in October of 2006. This is just a few months after the announcement they were putting it up for sale. It was in fact sold to Tishman Speyer and BlackRock. And it became the largest residential real estate transaction in American history. And the new owners were now poised to usher in a new era to this middle-class community. Well, what kind of new era did they have in mind? Well, it was not one that the tenants particularly wanted. At the time of the sale, 3/4 of the units were rent stabilized, and the rest were renting at the market rate. Tishman Speyer and BlackRock, in their purchase, they'd just taken on $4.4 billion in debt. So of the $5.4 billion in their purchase price, they borrowed $4.4 billion to get them there. And they had to find a way to generate more revenue from the property in order to pay off their debts and to make the deal profitable. This was not the sort of situation where somebody bought the buildings understanding that the rent roll paid for their debt obligations. No, that was not the case here. They knew that the rent roll supported a fraction of what they needed to make to pay off their debt obligations, and therefore they needed to increase the rents in order to make their deal work. And there were a few ways for them to do that. Most importantly, an owner under New York law at the time could take a low rent apartment out of rent stabilization once it became vacant. So the remaining rent stabilized tenants in Stuyvesant Town, now 75% of the community, so that's a lot of people, they were a direct obstacle to Tishman Speyer and BlackRock to getting their rental income up and allowing $4.4 billion of debt to be repaid. This deal did not pencil out unless Tishman Speyer and BlackRock got these people out of their units and fast. And what happened was this century's most significant housing battle quickly developed. Tishman Speyer hung luxury rentals banners from the sides of the red brick buildings. They closed the local supermarket and replaced it with a gym. They offered new amenities for a fee that could attract younger tenants. They hosted rock concerts in the middle of Stuyvesant Oval. But most importantly, they tried to create vacancies. Legal claims, many with flimsy allegations, rained down on a number of longtime, perfectly legitimate tenants, putting them on notice that they were going to be evicted. Now, the most common legal claim was that a resident was not actually living in their apartment as their primary residence. Under the rent stabilization law, in order to be eligible for an apartment with those protections, you need to live in it. That's a good rule because not that many people get to live in these apartments. And if they exist, they should be occupied by people who actually are full-time New York City residents. So the new owner started to do research on residents to see if they could find their names popping up on other properties or with voter registrations or electric bills or anything they could possibly find in other jurisdictions. And when they found a match, they filed a legal notice against the resident, with or without further evidence that they had actually lived in the other location. And in some cases, they just found somebody of the same name, but it happened to be a different person altogether. So the Tenants Association and I encouraged people to fight back. Through the course of a decade, we used every ounce of leverage that we could find. And really, that's the most important point about the book and about the story and about this discussion today, which is leverage. And more specifically, creating some where you have none. So how did we do that? Well, first of all, in 2006, when we learned that Metlife was going to sell Stuytown, rather than just sit on the sidelines and wait and see what was going to happen, we decided to take the risky move of trying to become bidders in the transaction ourselves. To do that, we obviously didn't go door to door collecting funds. That would have made no sense. Rather, we publicly announced that we were going to put together an investor group to buy the property from Metlife, and we invited various institutions to come forth to partner with us. We had no money. Truly, we had no business announcing that we were going to compete with the world's most significant real estate entities. It could have been a spectacular failure, but we took a risk and we did it anyway. And sure enough, nearly every investor looking to get an edge in this deal reached out to us with an eye toward partnership. Now, ultimately, we, the tenants, put together a $4.5 billion bid to buy the property. $4.5 billion from the tenants and their local city councilman. It came $900 million short. You know, what's $900 million among friends here? But we came short by $900 million. But the sums that we actually were able to achieve surprised a lot of people. And it made them pay a lot closer attention to the Tenants Association and their brand new city councilman. Then when Tishman Speyer became the owner and the residents found themselves to these baseless legal claims, we found ways to defend their interests. This included not only funding legal services in the city budget, but also giving Tishman Speyer a black eye for their actions. We also litigated and won the biggest tenant victory in the New York Court of Appeals in a generation. When we made our bid back in 2006, we learned that Metlife and then Tishman Speyer had been taking advantage of a tax abatement while also deregulating apartments at the same time. That was not allowed under the law that created this tax abatement. The law on this was surprisingly clear, and we saw it when we were making our bid. And our argument was simple. When you take this tax break, you can't deregulate the units. That's it. I know your business plan is to take apartments out of rent stabilization quickly, but when you're taking this tax break, you can't deregulate the units. And the Court of Appeals agreed with us. And the result was that no unit of Stuytown could be taken out of rent stabilization. That, of course, made it impossible for Tishman Speyer to achieve its business goals. It removed the most critical tool that they had in their arsenal. Remember, vacancy decontrol, creating vacancies. They couldn't do that anymore. I mean, they could create the vacancy, but to no effect. They couldn't raise the rents. And it also doomed their business plan to failure. And in 2010, Tishman Speyer, in fact, did default on its loans. And 4 years after its first sale, the future of the community was again uncertain. So what happened? Through our advocacy and agitation, the real estate world became even more aware of the tenants' presence and influence. We didn't just want to be agitators here. That's the easy route, just complain about things. While we were advocating for tenants, therefore, we also were working on a second bid. So we wanted to buy the property after Tishman Speyer's default. We don't want to see another auction like what happened in 2006 that simply sold the property off to the highest bidder, where the tenants and the city's interests were simply ignored. And that's really what happened in 2006 when Metlife sold the property to Tishman Speyer. We had seen that movie before. That meant that the tenants needed to not just complain, but also to take steps to be a commercially viable and respected potential counterparty for investors. Now, how do you do that with 30,000 people, you might ask? Well, simply put, we did it with a lot of care and a lot of hustle. We took extraordinary and exhausting steps to keep people with wildly varying interests focused on our joint goals, which I'm going to discuss a little bit more in a bit. And we presented a unified front. And what that did was to give potential partners the opportunity to sit across the table from me and the Tenants Association and believe that they could actually strike a deal with someone. We hired professionals like the powerhouse law firm, Paul Weiss, and the restructuring giant Moelis & Company. And these were big names to be associated with a tenants association, but they took a chance to work with us essentially on a contingency payment fee structure because we persuaded them that any future deal required the participation and the endorsement of the Tenants Association. And of course, while we surrounded ourselves with professionals, we also continued to make a lot of loud and public demands to send a clear message that any buyers needed to deal with us or they were going to have obvious problems. So balancing that role of agitator on the one hand versus negotiator was a careful one, and one that had the potential to throw off our efforts, on a number of occasions. When you're entering into a negotiation with someone, you don't want to be attacking them at the same time. It does not usually help you get to a positive outcome. So it was a delicate balance. One specific point of leverage that resulted from our advocacy was that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac publicly agreed at our request not to serve as lenders to any prospective owners of Stuytown unless they had the support of the tenants and the city. So to get them to agree to that, we had public and private help from our Senator, Chuck Schumer, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, and Deputy Mayor Alicia Glenn and her Chief of Staff, James Patchett. But by taking their low-cost financing off the table, unless the deal had our support, suddenly we had affected the economics of any future deal. And we began to understand that after Tishman Speyer's default, the lenders who were in charge of the sale from that point going forward, they were very worried about the amount of noise that the tenants were making. The more noise, the hairier Stuytown looked to investors, and the lower the value was ultimately going to be for them as the owners. In short, we made the alternative of not working with us considerably less attractive. Finally, the political support that we got from Mayor de Blasio was critical in showing our political strength. Everyone understood that any deal was going to be carefully scrutinized by the city. And even though the city truly had no official or legal role, the mayor and his team did a great job in making their interests known. Ultimately, through tenacious advocacy, we were able to strike a deal between a new owner, it's the Blackstone Group, the city, and the tenants that preserved thousands of units as affordable housing for the next generation. And it was New York City's largest affordable housing preservation deal in history. We did this through a regulatory agreement that runs with the property. So it does not matter who the owner is today or into the future, that agreement is something that will affect Stuyvesant Town. So the most incredible part of this entire story here is that CW Capital, that was the entity that represented the lenders, called a special servicer, they had no obligation to strike an affordable housing deal with us. The city had no legal power to force them to the negotiating table. The tenants and I had no right to force any particular outcome. And if CW Capital, on behalf of the lenders, if they had allowed it, any new owner could simply have paid a top dollar in the sale and taken steps to make Stuytown that luxury community that Tishman Speyer had aspired to do slowly and steadily over time. So 5 years and now one book later, there are a few key lessons that I have learned from this experience. While Stuytown may seem unique, it's really not. There are a lot of tax breaks, incentives, programs to preserve affordable housing that expire over time. And without work, they will in fact expire. So for others who find themselves facing a challenge related to affordable housing in this context, I might offer a few thoughts. The first and the most important is that even if the deck is stacked against you, that does not mean that you can't get to the goal that you want. In Stuytown, the tenants were an afterthought when Metlife sold the property in 2006 to Tishman Speyer. We weren't part of Metlife's plan or their strategy. We were so out of the mix that their lobbyists called to give me that courtesy heads up that they were selling Stuytown, home to 30,000 people, just minutes before the news became public to the world. So we saw where we stood. And rather than just complain about the potential loss of affordable housing, we put together a multi-billion-dollar bid to try to buy Stuytown for the tenants to be able to enjoy home ownership. And while we lost in that bidding process, we put the tenants on the map. We made so much noise that it became important politically for all future owners to have to deal with us. We litigated, we agitated, we organized the community, and we created an environment where no future deals could happen without our support. So the second lesson, and it relates to the first, is it's useful to find ways to increase your power. We increased our power by getting influential people to support our position. At every press conference, we had each and every elected official from the neighborhood present in a united front. When we announced our plans in 2006, both US Senators Chuck Schumer and Hillary Clinton signed on in support of our efforts. When elected in 2013, Mayor de Blasio was vocally supportive of our effort, and I invited him to make that point as clear as possible. I will note that I unsuccessfully tried to get him to officially tally a certain number of units for Stuyvesant Town in his official affordable housing plan. When mayors come in, they say, I'm going to create or preserve X number of units. And I said, well, why don't you include a certain number of those units from Stuytown in your total? That didn't happen. But I settled with having him signal his support by coming for a high profile and publicized meeting with the Tenants Association to share some cannoli, because those, of course, are important whenever you have the mayor over for an afternoon meeting, in the living room of my Peter Cooper Village apartment. And I thought that it made a very important symbolic point for him to be sitting right there in my apartment with the tenant leaders to signal his support. More than any words, that image of him in my apartment spoke volumes. And even though we had dissent within the community and the mayor himself didn't agree with all the parameters of our plan, we conveyed that we had the mayor's support, and 30,000 people united in support of a specific goal. So having him munching on cannolis in my living room certainly helped us to convey that view. Third, we worked to make our counterparty's position less attractive. So after the default by Tishman Speyer, the lenders in the deal were represented by this special servicer called CW Capital. For all intents and purposes, they were the decider. They were the decider not only about the process, but also the outcome for the long-term ownership of Stuytown. By creating so much noise and disruption, we were able to get Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac committed to staying on the sidelines, which drove up the cost of borrowing for a new buyer. And CW Capital understood that the tenants had the potential to scare bidders away if they were unhappy, and also to drive down the sale price. So it was an effort to make our counterparty's position even less attractive. Fourth, we needed to find common ground among a diverse group of stakeholders within the tenant community. We had 30,000 people and at least 30,000 opinions. The Tenants Association had proposed giving tenants the opportunity to own their own apartments. But in order to ensure long-term affordability, we hope to build in some restrictions on the resale of those units to make them sold only to people who qualified as middle income. Now, some residents thought that was smart. That was just the right move to make. Others thought that restrictions on resale of any type were un-American. Others still thought that we should never do anything to take rent-stabilized rental units out of rent stabilization, ever, even if it meant giving people a chance, though not an obligation, to buy their apartments. There were plenty of reasonable disagreements and also spoilers out there. So to keep people united, we focused them on our points of commonality, namely that we all had an uncertain future if the Tenants Association was not setting the agenda. People may have disagreed with the details of what we were doing, but we argued they surely would disagree with what some sovereign wealth fund would come in and do. Tishman Speyer, take two. We created mini forums, committees for people to air their views based on specific areas of expertise. We gave opportunities for our neighbors to directly interact with our professional advisors and to, we hoped, buy into the process and recognize the sheer complexity of what we were trying to accomplish. We had constant community meetings, house parties, and even telephone town halls to share information and updates. We also asked people to sign an agreement. It was non-binding, this agreement. We called it a unity pledge that said that they were working in concert with the Tenants Association's efforts for the future of Stuytown. All of that, plus our active public voice in support of the tenants, kept the community and politicians pulling the boat roughly in the same direction. And that was what we needed. Finally, it was important that we build a coalition that was broader than our own immediate interests in Stuytown. While Stuytown was the poster child for predatory equity in housing, the story of private equity snapping up rent-regulated housing in order to push people out, that was happening all around the city. So we connected to labor unions and housing activists from around the city who were dealing with the same issue. In 2007, housing advocates organized a human ring called Hands Around Stuytown to encircle all of Stuytown as a visual show of support for our efforts and to challenge these very practices. Later on, I formed a coalition with two other council members, Jumani Williams of Brooklyn, who's now the public advocate, and Richie Torres, who is now congressman from the Bronx, to combat predatory equity in housing. And together, we got 50 elected officials from all levels of government to demand that Fannie and Freddie not lend into a predatory deal, and that our own city and state pension funds stay clear of such investments, and that the city and the state take steps to expose bad actors. Ultimately, though, the Stuytown story is about a well-organized group of tenants that banded together to fight back against corporate greed and excess, and how the real estate world concluded that actually working with the tenants would yield a better outcome than a prolonged battle, and how a choppy but successful negotiation played out both in public and in private over many years, and then delivered an extraordinary outcome for middle-class New Yorkers. So that's the story in a nutshell. Obviously, there's an entire book that goes along with all of this, and I encourage you to spend a little more time with it, because I think I know I am biased, but I think it's an interesting story, and hopefully you will find the way it is told compelling. But I'm going to stop there and see if I can answer any questions or go deeper in any subject or clarify anything at all. So again, thank you so much for having me to this discussion. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you, Dan. So if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and raise your hand. And you can also put a question in the chat. But to get the discussion started, I have a question about the legal framework, because I know you mentioned that tax abatement and the fact they were taking advantage of the tax abatement and also trying to remove those units from rent stabilization. From that point, have there been any changes to prevent these kinds of loopholes, or has there been any regulation that improves this kind of situation to prevent that?
The first is that tax abatement never allowed for rent stabilized units to be taken out. So the change was unnecessary because the law itself was clear. So that question was litigated and clarified, but it didn't change. The thing which was the biggest change in housing policy that affects a situation like this is in 2019, the New York State Legislature and governor passed a package of reform bills to help protect rent stabilized tenants. And one of the protections that they made was they made rent stabilization permanent, so it didn't need to expire and get renewed every 3 years. But they also killed vacancy decontrol. So it is no longer possible to take an apartment out of rent stabilization when it becomes vacant. And it just goes to show how critical those state laws are to protecting tenants. Because if vacancy decontrol were not an option back in 2003, 4, 5, before Metlife decided to market the property for sale, the story's just not that interesting. Nobody would overbid. I mean, maybe they'd overbid, but they wouldn't overbid with a plan to evict people to create vacancies. That wouldn't be relevant. You evict people and create vacancies, you can't even raise the rent. So why even go through that headache? So we would have entirely changed the dynamic here. And it was not until 2019, years after we struck our deal to preserve Stuytown, that vacancy decontrol went away. And that was the biggest. That to me is the biggest. That was the tool which was used by Tishman Speyer and BlackRock and MetLife to get people out of their apartments. And that tool was eliminated by the state legislature.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. One less direct and more insidious way that rent stabilization is undercut is major capital improvements, where a tenant is forced to have their rent increased by overpaying for overpriced capital improvements. Can you tell us the history of MCIs and its effect on rents in Stuytown?
I can. Well, major capital improvements under New York state law historically have allowed an owner to make an improvement to their building, and then pass on the costs of those improvements in full to the people who live in the building. Not all at once, but sort of over time. But the interesting point about it is that once the improvements were paid off, they didn't come off the rent bill. They stayed on permanently on the rent bill. So you can imagine an owner putting in a new boiler, that costs, this is not fact, but let's just say it costs $10,000. You pass on that $10,000 to your residents and they pay for it in full. Once you get to the $11,000 and $12,000, that money starts going directly into the pocket of the owner. And people thought that was deeply unfair. I thought that was deeply unfair too. And what started happening in the late 90s was Metlife went from being a more modest company to a public company with shareholders. And they started looking at their real estate assets a little bit more, aggressively. And they started using MCIs as a way to not only improve buildings, but also to pass costs on to residents. And they were doing that with greater urgency in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And it created a lot. That was the primary source of conflict between the tenants and landlord when I first came on the scene as a city councilman. And the tenants were constantly in a battle to fight back against these things. And usually it was just a technical battle because, the state law allowed for them to do it. So the tenants were challenging them to slow them down. They were challenging them to, justify every cost that they were spending, but they were not frequently successful in their efforts to stop them from happening. As part of that 2019 package of reforms, the MCI laws also changed, and they changed in a way that allowed owners to pass on less of a percentage of the improvement onto residents. And it more, it benefited tenants' bottom lines in that it was no longer a forever at maximum cost transmission of that obligation. So the MCIs are now in a different place than they were when I came on the scene too.
Great, thank you. Do you have any other questions? I think we have another one in the chat. This is a corollary to that question. Do you think an MCI reparations legislation would be likely to move forward in general for New York City?
Reparations, huh? Interesting thought. No, I don't think so, but I love the concept. It's a hard argument to make that an owner, I'll just play devil's advocate for a second, once they have operated in a way that was consistent with state law, and it was consistent with it was a terrible state law, but they were operating in a way that was consistent with state law, to then ask them to pay or force them to pay a penalty for something that they didn't actually do wrong. That to me sort of becomes a difficult argument to make, even though tenants should, obviously tenants were getting socked with it for years. It just would be a very hard legal argument to make. And I suspect it would probably be challenged if it passed. But it's the way we should be looking at the dynamic between landlord and tenant now, because there were so many years these laws favored the landlords. And I think it's time that we, take a harder look at some of those things like MCIs, like vacancy decontrol, the permanence of rent stabilization. These were all good things for the state legislature to be focusing on, to balance out what had been a truly imbalanced situation for many years favoring the landlord community.
So we have a few more minutes left, and I don't know if anyone else has any questions. I don't want to hog the time, but another question I had, given the eviction crisis that's looming, and in New York, the fact that so many people have left, is there anything that you see on the horizon, maybe a response to these private equity firms and this predatory behavior in the markets, that we could prevent, knowing that's going to happen? Because in the past, we weren't really, that came as a surprise, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is it's related to the others, which is strengthening those legal protections for residents so that even if you do have an unscrupulous owner who decides to sort of wield the loopholes within the law as a weapon against people, that it's very difficult for them to do that. That to me is the biggest protection. And you need to have those protections in place, assuming that something bad will happen. Can't assume that things will work out. You have to write these laws assuming that somebody will find a tool to take advantage of them. Private sector in real estate, private sector everywhere is creative, and that's good. They're creative, but you want them to use it for good. And I think that, what policymakers need to do is set the standards the way that respect people's lives and ensures that they're not going to be on the receiving end of bad acts, and then step back and let the private market proceed. But you can't leave these loopholes and assume they're not going to be used. They're going to be used. They're always going to be used. So I think that the key here is strong laws emanating first from the state capital, and supported, of course, with city enforcement.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? I'll throw you a soft one. Do you still keep in touch with the Tenants Association, and how has that been? Since the battle's over.
Yep. Well, I'm in close touch. One of the characters from the book was over at my apartment for dinner last night to reminisce and sign a few books and talk about the experience. Yes, I think they have a forever battle on their hands, right? They are the Tenants Association for the largest rental community in the United States. That is always going to be a challenging position. There's always going to be something for them to think about and fight back against. And so, yes, I am in close contact. I consider myself a friend, an advisor, a counselor. And yes, that is an important relationship for me and one that I intend to keep.
Jeremy, I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead. And then afterwards, Diana has a question in the chat, and then I think we can.
Dan, it seems like the bankruptcy of treatment kind of gave you guys an opportunity, another go at it. Now, could it have gone wrong? Like, could it have gone in favor of the landlord using the bankruptcy protection in general to really not let you guys do what you wanted to do?
It is possible that things would not have gone in our favor. In fact, it was likely that things were not going to go in our favor. We were preparing ourselves for what might happen in the various scenarios: a bankruptcy, foreclosure, sale, preemptive sale, all of those things. But we knew that we had very few rights. I mean, the tenants had very few rights to force this thing to an outcome that was favorable to us. And that, frankly, is the most interesting part of the story, which is how do you create success where you really don't have any real rights to demand a certain outcome? And so, yes, it is very possible. And we were worried. I can tell you, I certainly was worried after years of fighting with Tishman Speyer and BlackRock, they defaulted. And on one hand, people said, hooray, ding dong, the witch is dead. Hooray, there's a time to celebrate. I also started to panic. It's like, oh my God, well, what happens now? What do we do now? Like, what is going to happen now? And, it was dicey, and it was uncertain for years. The things that Stuytown has going forward is that because so many people invested so much money in it with an eye toward increasing the revenue, that's not like drive the community down into the ground and pull out every dollar. That is invest so that you can attract fancier people. So the thing that it had going for it was a very different dynamic than you sometimes see in housing schemes where people are trying to make a buck out of rent stabilized housing. This one was about investing, increasing the quality of the experience. Not all agreed on, what that looked like or whether the quality was in fact enhanced, but it was invest, rent for more money, and therefore be able to get higher revenues out of the property. But the short answer to your question is no, it was not a foregone conclusion that any of this was going to work out. We were worried right up to the end that the property could be sold without any tenant support, without the mayor's support, without anything. We worried about a foreclosure. We worried about bankruptcy. We worried about all of those things. And from my own perspective, the only thing that we could do was make sure that the tenants were organized, well represented, and with political strength. That's all we could do, because those things, and particularly in a bankruptcy, it might have mattered, were going to work in our favor.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. We have time for one last question from Diana. When Tishman Speyer purchased Stuytown, did the company calculate how many rent stabilized tenants they need to flip to market rate to make the deal lucrative? It just seems so incredible the company was interested in purchasing Stuytown, given the majority of rent stabilized tenants and the amount of litigation needed to forcibly remove tenants.
Diana, that is a very astute question. They most certainly looked at it, and they looked at what historically the numbers were. Now, I should say, I wasn't in the room. I don't know how closely they looked at it, but I know that it was central to their whole plan. So the facts that were available to them were the historical numbers of turnover of rent stabilized residents. Metlife, on the other hand, saying to them, oh, you know what? We never went after those people. You can do a lot more over there. You got a lot of illegal residents, people who are not properly living in their apartments. You can do much better. Ignore the historic data, because we were the prior landlord. We weren't that active on that front. And then you had people like Metlife's own property manager, Adam Rose of Rose Associates, saying, you guys are out of your mind if you think that you're going to move that many rent stabilized tenants out. It's just not going to happen. It's never going to happen. So I don't know what exactly they were looking at, but I do know that they clearly believed the notion that I think was being pitched by Metlife, that they had been a sleepy institutional landlord that had not done the things that you could do to really extract more value out of the place. So ignore the historic numbers, focus on what we're saying for the future, for revenue possibilities. But they definitely looked at it. They just made a mistake.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll leave you if you want to say any last words, but I want to thank everyone for joining.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate your interest in the subject, and thank you for taking a look at asking for the link in the book. To stay in touch with me, my website is dangarodnick.com. It's got all the info there on how to reach me, and press clippings from reports about the book and things like that. But most importantly, I hope you read it. I hope you like it, and always welcome your feedback. So it's good to be here, and I appreciate your inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions, and we'll see you soon for our Food for Thought speaker series.